No, I was just going to say, welcome to the inaugural Cliveden Literary Festival, and over to the experts.
Thank you very much. We're going to discuss not books, but museums. And I'm your chairman, I'm Simon Jenkins. I have a somewhat ambivalent relationship with museums, so it's going to be an interesting discussion. Many years ago, I was coming out of the British Museum in London, and a Japanese couple came up to me and they said, "Excuse me, could you direct us to the British Museum?" And I said, "You just left it." And they said, "No, we're looking for the British Museum. Where is it?" And I said, "This is the British Museum. You've just been in it." And they said, "No, you're in that." I love Japanese people. "You're mistaken. This is not the British Museum. This is the Egyptian Museum, the Greek Museum, the Roman Museum, the Etruscan Museum. There's nothing British in it. Where is the British Museum?" And I was left thinking, I can only describe as ambivalent about museums. They portray themselves in peculiar ways. But I did think, what would a British museum look like? I tried the V&A, but that's the V&A, as the Japanese people explained to me. Where's the British one? And it was, of course, in the great cathedrals, the great churches, the market towns, the countryside, the glory of the English countryside, the architecture of Britain. That's the British Museum, and mercifully it's not in some great mausoleum in London. So get the hell out of London and find it. That was my approach to doing a series of books on this subject. And out of that, I developed a skepticism about great big mausoleums in London, admirably represented on the stage here today. Now, whenever we discuss museums, we have the same argument. Are they about being great palaces of art, display, design, for the glory of the nation and your delectation, in every sense, magnificent representations of civilization? Or are they just thundering great windowless buildings with masses of stuff on the walls, boring schoolchildren to tears? 80% of the stuff not even being on the walls, but in the basement underneath. This is the argument. So let's have it on stage now today. We couldn't have a better team here. We've got Yana Rothschild, the chairman of the National Gallery, the grand old lady of Trafalgar Square. That's the museum, not Hannah Rothschild, yes. Nicholas Cullinan of the National Portrait Gallery, the Museum of the National Obsession with Selfies, and the new thrusting hyperactive outsider from the Serpentine, Yana Peel. So welcome all of you. Just to introduce you to the audience, so to speak, could each of you just give us in 2 sentences what it is you see your institution as doing? What's it really about?
Me, right. No pressure. Well, we are, technically, we are the keeper and the displayer of the national collection of great art from 1300 to 1900. So that is our remit. But actually what I think we do is we provide for free a place of contemplation and solace, a receptacle of stories, the distillation of excellence over 5 centuries, people who've tried to capture the human spirit and the human struggle. And I think that's what we're about.
Nicholas.
Well, our remit is adjacent to Hannah's, and we're literally adjacent to Hannah, but somewhat different. So we're more focused on issues of identity and British history. So obviously we focus on portraiture as a genre, but what we're really looking at is British history from the Tudors to now, or as I say, from the time of Catherine Parr to Martin Parr. So we span 500 years, and we're very much about art and portraiture, but also about biography, history, and identity. It's quite a unique remit.
Now, Yana, you don't have a permanent collection. How do you see your purpose?
I think, as you say, it's quite schizophrenic in the fact that we are certainly not a mausoleum where art can go to die, because we're not only a mausoleum, we are a converted tea house in the heart of Kensington Gardens. So for us, it's really an open landscape for art and ideas. We have the extraordinary building built by John Gray West in 1932, and the recent addition by Zaha Hadid, and in her spirit that there should be no end to experimentation. It really is this factory of ideas. So in 2 sentences, I guess I would say that we are really about inspiring the widest audiences with the urgency of art and architecture in today's society. And without having that permanent collection, it's really about putting the voice of the artist into the most important conversations of the day.
Now, when I go into any of these galleries, but particularly the first 2, I am looking at what I would have found 100 years ago. large amounts of wall space with pictures on them. It is extraordinary that technologically that it really hasn't changed. I'm looking at what I was looking at before. In 50 years' time, will I still be looking at these pictures on these walls?
Yeah, well, I think it's a question we ask ourselves all the time about whether the future and what will happen to cities, to museums. And I think the analogy I would make is, my children can get any song anywhere in the world free, but actually what they want to do is save up their pocket money to go and see a live artist. And I think there's an authenticity about going to see the real thing in a museum, which is where it's safest, which I don't think will go away. So I think in 50 years' time, we, the National Gallery, will reach hundreds of millions of people online, but there'll be a devoted coterie of people who actually want to come and stand in front of the real McCoy.
And those two things aren't mutually exclusive, they actually can complement each other in a very effective way. And just to say one thing about when you come to the National Portrait Gallery, this is where we're a little bit different from the National Gallery, that obviously we go right through to now, to the contemporary, and what's quite unique about us is that we commission portraits. We're the only institution to commission works for the collection by our trustees. And so we're thinking actively not just about issues of current British history or identity, but also what medium should we represent. And one thing that struck me when I started 2 years ago is that still when you walk around the galleries, even when you get to the contemporary, it's mostly told through paintings. And of course, artists work now in a variety of mediums, including film, photography, installation. So as we go on, we're going to think much more about how you can make portraiture in a variety of mediums. So hopefully when you come back in a few years' time, it will be a little bit different.
When I go to the Serpentine, there is always something new happening. I mean, including a new building in the park outside each year. I mean, is that going to continue? Or I mean, what's the sort of logical extension of that?
I think that's an interesting point in terms of how do we embrace the evolution, the change, the transformation, that speed with which our audience is coming to us to see the newness that you mentioned, but how do we use that to really enhance the very things that make us human? And so I think that's a challenge that we all face and an opportunity really in terms of that embrace. For us, it's really the architectural pavilion. And so the 17 years that incredible project has been going to render the Serpentine the most visited destination for architecture in the world, according to Dezeen, it means that what you're doing is building on the success. Panofsky said, of course, the future is always built from fragments of the past. And so we're looking at those exhibitions, the Bacon, the Man Ray, and then looking at how do we enable artists like Ian Cheng next spring to work with artificial intelligence to really attract a visitor that might not otherwise come. So for us, between the art, the architecture, and the live events, in this first year, I realized it was 260 artists that we worked with. So of course, there is a challenge in not being the custodian of these incredible legacies, but it also sets the bar in terms of the kind of experimentation and the kind of experience that you are obliged to offer the audience.
You're a catalyst. Yeah.
But just to explain to those who don't know, I mean, each year the Serpentine commissions an architect to build a pavilion in the grounds, then you sell it.
Then we sell it.
You try and sell it.
Yes. And last week, I had a mayor of China's Dongcheng district come and visit, and he stood in front of this Francis Carey pavilion, which was the 17th in the series and the first by an architect from Africa. It's off to Malaysia. It's been sold. It's been generously supported by Goldman Sachs. It's a labor of love, like everything at the Serpentine, for which we don't charge entry. And he couldn't believe that this project cost £1 million. I could see the mayor of China's busiest and most resource district thinking, this is £1 million project for the nation for free, how does it work? And yet there's something incredible about a story my artistic director tells the taxi driver whose child runs into the pavilion and just realizes that even though the gallery itself might seem somewhat unwelcoming or not a place where he or she might wish to visit, there's something about a 6-month pavilion that welcomes performances, that welcomes discussions, that welcomes refugee women on Wednesdays to celebrate tales of survival in the city. That means that every summer, when you come to the Serpentine, there is a new pavilion. And watch this space. We are just this week selecting with our advisors, Richard Rogers and David Adjei, what the next pavilion will look like for an architect who has never built before in the UK.
Now, just taking that approach to a space, just called it a space, and back to you. Hannah mentioned the interesting parallel with music. Now, you find young people today, they're not interested in, they stream it, but they don't buy recordings and so on nowadays. They want the authentic musician playing in front of them, and they'll pay a fortune for that. And they won't pay anything for recorded music. The reason to me is that they think they're seeing something so-called authentic in front of them. How do you replicate that in a museum? Because I mean, you haven't got, I mean, it would be nice to think you've got artists painting old masters in front of them. They can actually see the artist working in the gallery. You don't have that. You've just got these bloody great pictures in frames everywhere.
But I think you do have that, actually. I would disagree. And I think every visitor to a museum has that because it's about their encounter on that particular day, in that room, with that work of art. And that's why people still come to museums in droves. It's actually increasing rather than decreasing. Because people, in a world of digital images, which we're all now saturated by, people want that authentic experience, that unique experience on their own. I think that's what draws people to museums.
I agree with that. I think also you can look at these pictures as kind of inanimate objects, which you're slightly suggesting they're just hanging around looking kind of beautiful.
Well, they are.
Well, no, but then you can look at them in a different way. You can think about their history, you can think about their provenance, you think about the stories they're telling. They can become incredibly exciting kind of metaphors for living.
And they change too.
All the time, exactly. And one's relationship with them changes.
You're changing the pictures, are you?
We're augmenting them. No, but I mean,
That Gaines was looking a bit dull. We can liven it up this week, yes.
But the reception around a work of art, or indeed a section of art history, is always changing. Like history itself, it's always in flux. It's never static. We're always rethinking the past, and it changes according to the present, which echoes what you said.
Yeah.
I think they're not mutually exclusive in that sense. If you come to the Serpentine now, the show that we just opened, the first photography show in the Sackler building, left to us by our dear and absent friend Zaha Hadid, it's a photography exhibition that's quite dark, it's quite disturbing. It's a Norwegian photographer who has an incredible Norwegian aura of nonchalance. And when I suggested that there was something dark or potentially perverse in this exhibition, he said, well, it activates what's inside the viewer. So that made me feel very concerned about myself. But I think whether it's activating something inside the viewer or whether you are, in essence, bringing virtual reality to an architect or an artist who is interested in using these tools, just like the evolution of the paint tube enabled impressionists to work outside, which was an incredible revolution in itself. I think these small revolutions are important for us to be able to explore within the context of what looks like unchangeable hardware or infrastructure.
So we've just introduced something called Smartify. So you
yes.
hold your phone, you too. So you hold your phone up to any painting in the National Gallery or National Portrait Gallery or Serpentine, and it gives you its history, it gives you who painted it, it gives you where it was painted. So in a way that suddenly becomes rather exciting. You're not, you can introduce AI, etc., into your artwork. Last week we did, or a couple of weeks ago, we did something called The Sunflowers Live, where we got all the different paintings of Van Gogh's sunflowers. And we created a virtual exhibition. We had Theo van Gogh standing in, I can't remember, it was Holland or something. And we had the same amount of people, 6.4 million people tuned into that, as come to the gallery every single year. So I think that we can and we should and we are reinventing the museum for the new age.
Why on earth do you need a gallery in central London if you can do that?
I knew you were going to say that, you see.
Because people want both.
They want both,
people want
exactly.
both. I mean, even the way that I understand museums or collections is through visiting, but increasingly online, researching, understanding what's on display, finding out more about a work of art. So, and we're not passive, we're not complacent, we're not just assuming that people will come, if you build it, they will come, and we can just show things and people will sit there. We're always thinking about a way to activate our collections, to engage our audiences, to expand our audiences too, and not just in terms of numbers, but to reach a wider and a more diverse audience. So I think the idea that museums are somehow these rather removed, elitist institutions is actually not, when you see how they work and the people that work there, I would say that's not true.
I can see what you're getting at, but I remember H.L. Mencken said way back in the 1920s, there was no more bored group of people than children in the Baltimore Art Gallery.
Let me debate, if I may. We showed Grayson Perry this summer. And for those of you who know Grayson Perry, he is the world's most famous transvestite potter and probably one of the greatest voices on British politics and populism of our day. Grayson Perry named his exhibition, very nonchalantly, the most popular art exhibition ever. And with that, he delivered an exhibition which for us was meaningful, not the kinds of numbers that you can appreciate, but 250,000 people over the course of the summer came through the gallery. And he really just united both sides, having launched June 8th at the day of the election. And so what I thought was incredible is that when we asked Grace and Perry, what would you like for your mobile tour? How would you like us to take you through the gallery? He said, I want to be able to look on your phone and have it say, look at the bloody art, right? And so that was Grayson's view. But with that said, what I've never seen is happier people in an art gallery. He, of course, did the Channel 4 show around it. He activated it in his own way. But at a time of great division, I think what art can do in a physical environment is also bring people together in ways that's very difficult to replicate. So it's a spectrum.
How important to that show was the fact that he was the most famous transvestite? I mean, he is a phenomenon. There's an element of eccentricity, freak about him, and I think that's part of the show, I felt. I mean, if he hadn't been, I wonder if there had been those cues. And I'm intrigued by the way which art and museum art now is bound up with the experience of the gallery and the museum, not the stuff on the wall.
Is that a problem? Do you see that as mutually exclusive?
No, not at all.
Only if there's a big queue.
Yes.
If there's a big queue.
But there is an issue where actually increasingly galleries are having to think about the shows and what shows will entice people in, because we rely more and more and more on exhibitions, and exhibitions are our cash cow, for want of a better word. So we do have to think more and more about, okay, what will appeal to X, Y, and Z, and how do we get people in?
But your raw material is a picture on a wall, and you think that's always going to be the case? I mean,
I think that for the National Gallery, personally, yes. I think it's completely different for your institutions.
But at the end of the day, if you think about it, sometimes it is a pile of silt in the gallery, and the John Latham show that we had last season was one that attracted a very narrow and niche audience, even though John Latham was an artist who, Nicholas would say, has just really shaped the future of the trajectory and was really Britain's equivalent to Robert Rauschenberg. And so I think for us there's a pendulum that has to shift between a blockbuster, which in no way compromises your identity,
can you see the day when Theresa May is represented by a pile of dirt on the floor of your gallery?
We haven't commissioned her portrait yet, so that happens.
You've got any abstract portraits yet? I mean, you are essentially realist. I mean, you have to be. They've got to be recognised.
Yeah, well, although there are questions around that. So, for example, earlier this spring we did the first exhibition around abstract portraiture, Howard Hodgkin, and those are portraits, and Howard very much conceived of them as portraits, but they're not figurative. They're between figurative and abstract. Just to sort of pick up on what we've been saying, one thing I would say is that, because I really hate this dichotomy between the popular and the blockbuster and something which is designed to appeal to people, and the niche or the intellectual, I actually really vehemently reject it. And I think one thing that's happening now, and this is actually very interesting in terms of museums and the way that people experience a physical museum in the building in front of the work of art, is that the digital is changing people's behaviour. And one thing that's happening is all of us, I think, are becoming much more proactive about finding the things that we want to find and finding things out and researching. So visitors are now much less passive and actually much more active in deciding what they want to see, what they want to find out about it. So I think you can't second guess the audience. And when we do a so-called blockbuster, the criteria for me is the quality of the exhibition, because I really give people credit for their intelligence. I never think, well, you can do this and lots of people will come, and it doesn't have to be that good as long as it's popular. It's always about the quality of what you do and the integrity of what you do. And if you do that, people actually, you can build an audience, and you can even build an audience for things that people don't know about, which I think is very interesting.
Moving on to the blockbuster question, we haven't got anyone from the Tate or the BM here, sadly. But
I used to be.
All right. Well, because you can answer for the
We can represent the
you can answer for the genre.
All fans of Maria.
I mean, I slightly sense in London, as against other galleries which all charge, that because you can only charge for blockbusters, you concentrate on, or they concentrate on blockbusters. And I feel the permanent collections, in a sense, are pushing into the background now, which is the inevitable consequence, I think, of where the money is. I mean, do you sense that too? Am I wrong?
It's a risk. It's a definite risk, and that's the British model of funding, which I've also worked in American museums which have a different model of funding, and both have pros and cons. I have to say I love the British model because museums are truly public. They're for the public. And I find that's what really excites me about working in museums, and that's why I got into it in the first place. One of the risks is that because there's as Hannah said, there's an emphasis on exhibitions just to keep income going, because that's where we actually get income, is that the collection can suffer. It's much more difficult to fundraise for the collection than it is to keep an exhibition model going. I don't know if you feel the same. But
yeah, completely. So basically we have to raise, I mean, our grant, this isn't a sob story, but our grants come down massively, 30% over 5 years. That's a big cut. and we have to raise roughly half the amount of money it takes to keep the gallery open from exhibitions, from catering, from philanthropy, etc., etc. So we have to do it. I mean, it's a fact, and actually, it brings a whole new audience in. So that's a plus side. But I think increasingly you're going to see this tension between needing to get people through the doors for financial reasons and to keep the gallery kind of fresh, etc., etc., and also compromising or forgetting what our core purpose is. I think I'm not saying it's not a problem. It is a problem. It's a challenge.
Are you saying that the big London museums, which are free, have some moral superiority to the Dutch, the German, the French ones that charge?
No, it's a different
Why are they
model.
different?
It's a different model.
Well, you get a different model. What's the difference?
Well, because in the case of our institutions, anyone can walk through the door free of charge 361 days a year and do, and use it for their own ends. The figures abroad are different, and the people using them, I would hate us to charge for the very simple reason I don't want us to become a place for the affluent tourist to hang out.
Have you read Simon's piece, of course, that it's not a sin to charge, which he's bound to bring up
yeah.
in this discussion?
Well, it isn't a sin,
but it's a hurdle.
Just not what we're
It's
doing.
different.
Yeah,
It changes
it's
the
different.
audience.
Yeah.
It changes the audience.
I mean, there's absolutely no evidence it changes the audience.
If we look
They've
at
been
the data,
survey after survey. There's no difference in the audience at the Rijksmuseum or the Louvre or the Met and the.
dare I throw out the numbers around since 2001? I'm sure those are much more familiar to you. But if you look at the first decade since the abolition of paid admission to British museums, I think it was 150% increase in attendance from the DCMS-funded museums, a doubling of attendance, and a great shift in the diversity of the audience. That's what the data says. You would know it much better. But I think in that sense, it does feel like if we're in an environment where the arts are being cut out of the e-back, we should be in a place where at least we're offering art for all.
Completely. And we've done the research in terms of charging, and we know that not only would our audience diminish and we would have few visitors, but the type of visitor would change. Just to give you one example, I would not be on the stage here today if it were not for the fact that museums in Britain are free, because it would have been a barrier to me growing up. I wouldn't have been able to go and, so actually it does have a big difference. And it's not about moral superiority at all. It's a different model, the American and the European model. But I do passionately love the British model because it is really civic and it's for the public. And I think that's a unique thing that we should be very proud of and celebrate.
For whom are you working then? Because you're not working for the public, you're working for the taxpayer who's paying for you. That means you're working, in a sense, for the government. And the government wants one thing in return, it wants numbers. So you cram them in. Looking at the figures, I was looking at the figures of the National Maritime Museum and elsewhere, it really was difficult to see some great gap between the British museums and the foreign museums. It just was difficult. And you can see great parties of school children swimming into the British Museum, for instance, making it really quite difficult to see the stuff. I mean, and your museum is very, very crowded.
Patrons get to see the stuff out of hours. And I think that raises the question of the fragility of the system, but also the need to be entrepreneurial, how you service your different audiences.
And diversify.
So I think we'd agree with you that there's an incredible fragility around a system that is continuously fundraising for acquisitions, for campaigns. It means, of course, that we are much more free with our trustees. We are not beholden to our trustees because the structure is so different. And
They're
so
not appointed to pay
appointed to
wages.
pay in that
They're there
certain
for their
way.
expertise.
But you're right in
You're
the sense-
always beholden to somebody. And if Tristram Hunt was here from the V&A, he's gone public recently. You end up serving your donors. So he's closing the gallery at night, which is a huge facility to the free visitors who basically come for a cup of coffee, mostly. They're closing the gallery so they can service the donors. Now, I just ask, who are these museums actually for? It is always distorting. The money always distorts. The only question is in what direction do you want to distort it. And the Met, which I knew quite well in New York, I feel is one of the most open museums I've ever been in.
Yeah, it is.
Well, you would have the most
Well,
inside
I
knowledge. You spent
went
so many years
to the
there.
Met. And to be fair to the Met, still it's a museum that you can visit for free, which is unlike most American museums and most museums in New York. There's a suggested donation. Exactly.
Just.
Yes.
$25.
And I remember being in New York many, many years ago and visiting the Met repeatedly when I didn't have much money and I could just walk in, and it's an extraordinary museum, possibly the greatest museum in the world, question mark to discuss. So there's a different model. But in terms of, I don't think there's so much of a conflict around the way that you fund a museum, because I'm very clear the reason I'm there is for the public, and it's for visitors who want to come and appreciate art and understand history. That's why I do everything I do. Now, behind the scenes, I do lots of different things. I fundraise, there's all kinds of management issues, but it's always for that person who comes and visits the museum. I'm very, very clear, but that's my raison d'etre, that's my sole focus. I don't know how you feel.
No, I think that's very beautifully put. And I think, listen, we're all looking at paying models all the time. I don't think any of us are saying no way. I think we're all looking at it, and it would be irresponsible of us not to think about it. But on balance, I think for economic, moral, spiritual reasons, I think it's better that if we can keep them free. So, for example, you talked about who we pay. Well, actually, for every pound of subsidy we get, we give back £3. If you ask of the 8 reasons that people come to Great Britain, for the 10 reasons people come to Great Britain, 8 is to visit free museums. It makes so much sense, I think, in holistically for the country, for museums to remain free. But it's not to say that we of course we are beholden to people. Of course we are. You know, I spend a lot of time being very nice to a lot of people. In this room. In fact, I kind of go to dinners now thinking, oh my God, who am I going to have to be very nice to tonight? But
No,
that's the deal, you know.
That's always been the case,
That's what we do, you know.
But I think, if I may, our model's somewhat different in that we only get 12% government funding. So that's £9.5 million, of which 8 million need to get raised each and every year. And of course, my chairman is Michael Bloomberg. In every board meeting, he says, Yana, can we charge? What is the model? There's such tremendous entitlement for offering what we offer in terms of 260 artists. And of course, the question is, what can we do so that we don't have to charge? Because that is always the last option available. And that will mean we'll have smaller audiences, we'll continue to keep the doors open. But until we get to that point, you know, there is an ecosystem in which one has to find that type of funding. And it's actually win-win. So if you're running a museum like a social venture, and you're thinking that it's a business that needs to host events, that needs to create an environment for partners that have defined KPIs. It's not really just sitting there and waiting for a handout. I think there's something that is very transactional. I ran a foundation for 10 years after leaving Goldman Sachs, and you know, Andy Warhol always said good business is the best art. So I don't think it's always a compromise. I think it's always a negotiation.
Well, I think that you used the word transactional. I mean, it is always a transaction. The question is who is it with?
But let me ask you a question. You've written about churches, about cathedrals and everything, and less people go to church. Do you think that in order to maintain our churches, our cathedrals, we should make everyone pay like we do to Westminster Abbey, 25 quid to go in?
Yes.
You think every church you should pay £25 to go in, whether you're worshipping or just visiting?
Cathedrals that charge attendances are going up. The reason is people, when they pay for something, they assume they're going to get some value. And in the case of cathedrals, they tend to get some value out of it.
But what if you don't have that money?
Yeah.
Don't?
What if you don't have that money? You're going to a small church.
Well, if you go to services, you can go to services for free. I mean, the assumption there's some great wall. So I'm questioning you. The assumption there's some great wall.
I'm
I thought we were on the same side. Remember? There was a debate. We were in it together.
There is no great wall. I mean, I work for The Guardian. The Guardian's free. Much debated how free it should be. And there are all these new concepts of charging, these paywalls and funnels and whatever. In the case of most of the museums that I know abroad, and I studied in America and on the continent, you have grades of charging. You have free Fridays, you have free after midnight, after 6, or you charge after 6. There are all kinds of ways of doing it. You don't have to pay young people, charge young people.
Yeah. But I think we all do that.
We do that.
I think we do that. If we look at the spectrum, as it were, I totally agree with you. When you pay £5 for a park night at the Serpentine, you are much more likely to show up and to hear Sampha in the park. So in terms of that pricing model, we certainly have that £5 model. Then we have the £20,000 model in terms of patronage. And along that, you know what the trade is. I think what's interesting and important to suggest is that even though we don't charge for Grace and Perry, once you're in the door, we will do everything we can to sell you a limited edition. When I say that we had a piggy bank that was this big, and that Grayson actually doubled what our annual donation was by creating a piggy bank that said black, white, straight, gay, rich, poor, that actually became the center, it just means we were more creative about how we encouraged each visitor with a new sign that says, please give us £4. So I think in that model of the Met at $25, first it was a suggested donation, then it was a more forceful donation. But it's not always a panacea, because what we've seen is, how do you ask a London visitor, are you British? Do you pay, do you not pay? Yeah. I think the definition of only allowing British people to use our institutions for free or charging a certain subset, as a society, just opens up the kinds of discussions that we'd rather work really hard and have lots of dinners to avoid by enabling this kind of more structured model.
Let's, before we go out to the audience, let's adopt this a new approach to this uncontroversial conversation. The thing that I find most difficult to defend is 90% of the stuff being underground. Now, it doesn't apply, I know, to your particular cases, but of the public art in Britain, 80 to 90% is never seen, or only seen very occasionally, including the Queen's collection. I think most people find that indefensible. Now, when I think Tiffany Jenkins, in her great book about this, said it's not for the public. Yeah. We're keeping it for the public, but they don't have to see it. We're keeping it for them. So they should be very, very happy that we're keeping it for them. An inherently absurd argument to me. But she then says, but we're keeping it for scholars, so scholars can have access to it. And I've never come across such an elitist point of view. Oh, and I do find the fact that all this stuff is mostly in London, underground. When the museums of the rest of England are closing, they're desperate. I've never seen such pathetic places, frankly, as the museums of the North East and the North West at the moment. They're all closing, one's closing almost every year. How can we defend that? I mean, it's no good just saying give the public money to them. It's not enough answer.
I don't think we disagree, and so certainly at the MPG we're always trying to lend as much of our collection across the nation as we can, to have as much on view as we can. We do a huge amount with lots of galleries around the country. We really want to work with them, collaborate and support them. I think there's a bit of a myth that museums hoard and sort of keep things squirreled away, and obviously there is storage because often you need to circulate collections, you need to conserve things. Think of a library. Just because there's a library and not all of the books are on loan doesn't mean that you dissolve the library. You need to have a repository sometimes, but the purpose of the library or the museum is to share what they have. So even though it's not all visible, it's all there for the public, and that's the idea. So I would never say it's being squirreled away for scholars, or it is for scholars too, but it's for many, many other people. I don't know if you agree or...
Yeah, no, I think I think the library is a good analogy. So more than half of our stuff is on display, and quite a lot of it then is travelling, or it's in conservation, or whatever. So it's not just sitting there kind of underground. I was a trustee of Tate for quite a long time, and there it's a much higher percentage of things which are not on display. I think I can't remember what the percentage is.
85%.
Oh, okay, I thought it was that. I'm trying not to say it out loud, actually.
Is this Chatham House?
Whoops. Anyway, sorry. But I think what they might argue is that they are a repository. They've got to keep collecting. They've got to keep growing, and that's a slight byproduct of it. But I agree, it shouldn't be like that. There should be a much better lending policy around the country, and artist rooms, which is, let's face it, a Dauphin Tate thing, has tried to do that, and we've got to do more and more.
Yeah. There's a huge consciousness. I think, rest assured, that there's a huge awareness as we talk about Tate rooms, as we talk about the late Martin Roth's plans to have the V&A collection on display in E20, so you could pick your favorite Etruscan object, or you could go and actually somehow find a way to see these objects that was not in a rarefied space. So I think what I've seen in this very new tenure in the past year is the incredible focus and intensity of how do we share the wealth of resource and knowledge and human capital that is concentrated in London across the regions. So every day we are thinking, our show has gone to Arnolfini, for example, even without a collection, how do we create the kinds of bridges where we appreciate that we are in this privileged position, but we have a responsibility to use whatever resources we have, be they physical or more virtual, and really share with the expertise we've made.
But ever since I've been involved in this subject, I've heard people saying what you just said. I mean, like for the past 30, 40 years, it's like a group of bishops saying, I wish people were better. The fact is, nothing happens, nothing changes. When I was at the National Trust, your museum was excellent, and a number of our houses have got exhibitions of portraits from the Portrait Gallery. But I went to the Tate, I got absolutely nowhere with them. And this is one of the great collections in the world. I mean, masses of very important pictures never see the light of day. They won't sell them to other people who might show them. They won't show them to other museums. They just squirrel them underground. And I'm afraid it's because museum directors regard them as theirs, not the public's.
I think that's a bit unfair. I'm sorry, actually. I think
coming from Russia, I think that might be the case at the Hermitage, but I don't think that's the case at Tate.
The stuff's there underground.
Go on.
Well, no, but I think the Tate. I mean, I don't want to defend the Tate because I'm not here to defend the Tate. None of us are, but. the cost of...
You'll have to do.
Why did that get a laugh? I'm a bit worried about that. It is, I mean, actually lending these things around, it's not incredibly simple. It's not a case of just getting a lorry and sending stuff out. You've got to insure them, you've got to, et cetera, make sure that they're in the... And I think the other thing is you can't sell them because they are a national asset. You're not allowed to sell them. You've got to look after them beautifully. I mean, I think there are so many different reasons, but I don't disagree. None of us are disagreeing with you. It must change, and
It's
it
how you
has been
change it.
slow. So it's how you change it.
And I think it is changing, but it's not changing fast enough. And
Yeah.
the simple reason for that isn't a lack of goodwill, it's funding, actually. And it's funding for the museum in London and the partner institution elsewhere in the country. And one thing that we have to do is therefore change the model. So one thing I've been thinking about is how could we lend not just an exhibition which another institution, say in Rochdale or Hull, or might not be able to afford. So one thing we're going to do is just lend one work, one star work, which is connected with that place. So the Brontes will go back to Haworth for a spell, or Francis Drake to Plymouth, etc., because that's achievable for that particular place and institution. So we have to rethink the model as well.
If I may, in the 10 years that we ran Outset, we brought over 100 pieces of art into the Tate collection with seemingly limited resources from Frieze. Now that has become the Outset collection. It's been incredibly meaningful for the young artists who were brought into that collection. And just thinking forward 100 years, to have Jeremy Deller's piece in perpetuity in a collection is so meaningful. I think there's all the question, what does deaccessioning mean in terms of a live artist's career? So if you look at the great stately homes and you look at the collections that have been amassed there, why is it so different for a museum not to be able to be a keeper of that legacy while also looking forward into furthering that agenda?
Well, I mean, the Kemble in Fort Worth was charged with dealing. Sell, buy, and it's become one of the great museums in the world as a result. The idea that you can't sell is not true. Trustees can sell. Dulwich can sell. They got into terrible trouble for doing so. Were they selling more, Dulwich would be a much greater museum, because provided you use the sales to enhance the collection, you can do all sorts of things. But there's a religion now that you should. It's a religion, not a policy.
We know pictures go in and out of fashion throughout history. So today's masterpiece would have been yesterday's rubbish tip. So actually, if you can imagine, if you look back at some of the curators or these people who you hold in such high esteem over the last 100 years, I mean, they might have sold, our what we consider today to be our national treasures. I think it's quite dangerous. Just to talk about Waddesdon, which is a National Trust house, which you know well, which our family is very involved with. I mean, we've got an exhibition, an exquisite exhibition at the moment of about 6 pictures. 2 belong to one of my relations. 1 comes from you. 1 comes from the Royal Collection. Not yours, but it comes from the National Collection. This is a very, very good example of actually how a house quite near here. It's half an hour, by the way. It's absolutely marvellous. Do go. You've got time this afternoon. But this is a very good example of how museums will lend outside, and you can create something exquisite. We get 400,000 people will go through Waddesdon doors and see a National Portrait Gallery and a Queen's picture out there. It happens.
It happens.
Yeah.
I mean, the Queen has got the greatest collection of Goyas on earth, and they're in her basement. I just think it's wrong that an individual, albeit a head of state, has this vast store of Leonardos, Holbeins, Goyas.
But there works on paper. You can't have those on
You can do amazing things with works on paper. There's always an excuse.
Yes.
I have to say, I've heard there's always an excuse for not changing.
How would you suggest the funds are redirected? So I think that's an interesting question, because if you do sell deaccession, do you suggest reinvesting in the art of the present or the future, or is it a whole different model in terms of
I point trustees to exercise their judgment. That's what I do. What's the problem?
But there is a very big risk of deaccessioning, and it's less so for us, but it's greater for regional museums, because when you're a museum which is struggling, if you have a work of art, so for example, the gallery in Huddersfield, near where I grew up, has a wonderful Francis Bacon. It was bought for them by the Arts Council in the 1950s. It's now worth, I don't know, 100 million more. Of course, the council, you can see the temptation to say, well, if we sell this, we can fund the museum and all these other things. But then you would find your regional museums being divested and stripped of all their great things. So there's a huge risk, actually, which goes counter to your argument about enabling and supporting regional museums.
It comes to tourism as well. If you look at the Albert Knox, if you look at Detroit, you think, oh, should you let failing cities fail?
Yeah.
So I think there's also a question of tourism and a question of attracting audiences. Do you use those resources to continue to keep cities alive? Or do you say, okay, there's super cities, or there's super museums, or there's super collections, and everything else should just find an edit?
So change nothing.
No.
Evolve.
Evolve, thank you, yes.
Right, let's come to the audience. Enough of us. Who would like to say something? Have we got a microphone too? Yes, there we are. Someone must have a view. There's over here, right? Okay.
I find myself agreeing with Simon on quite a lot of this debate, and I'd just like to say, in terms of that regionality, we had the privilege of going to the Bose Museum, which is in the northeast, and I think is one of the most fantastic museums in the country. If it was in London, it would be a big attraction, I think. But they charge, and they don't charge very much, and they charge an amount that if you can go back anytime you want within a year, but for the £15 or whatever it is to go in, it's a good deal. And I just think that we should be doing that more often and all over the country, and moving as much as we can of these collections out of London into the northwest and northeast, into Wales or wherever. I think there's too much in London. That's a question.
Well, I think you know the answer you're going to get. No, I mean, we have discussed it, but
I don't even think it's either or. I think our responsibility is also to bring our ideas to China and to bring our ideas to Silicon Valley. And so for me, it's not, dare I say, with my Canadian accent, just the responsibility of bringing it up and down the UK. I think if you have excellence in your institution and you are privileged to be in central London and be the keepers and custodians, I think there's a global responsibility. Yeah. So I think we totally agree with you. We wouldn't even stop at the Northeast. I think we would look quite globally at how we can share and be very open in terms of that exchange of ideas.
Yeah. I mean, I would just say that it's not one size fits all. So what works for one gallery in one part of the country might not work for another gallery, because it depends on their audience and their community. So it's difficult to say, well, charging or not charging. It really depends on what works for the institution or the museum. But I still feel in London there shouldn't be a need for us to charge, because we have so many resources in terms of audience, location, that actually we can share things much more if we're able to keep our doors free. It might be different for other galleries, and that's a different story, but I think for us, I would really want us to remain open to everyone.
Why is it right? In a sense, morally right, because that came into your answer, to charge the Tate St Ives, but not the Tate London.
Well, again, I think it might be a different audience, and so sometimes in a regional gallery there's a smaller audience in terms of numbers through the door, and also it's a smaller audience in terms of the type of person that visits, perhaps, and so therefore that audience might be more willing or amenable to pay an entry fee. So I can't speak on behalf of those institutions.
They're stinking rich in St Ives and they're all poor in London?
No, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying you might have a different visitor profile. I imagine you do. I don't have the figures in front of me, so I can't speak for that gallery, but I would imagine you get a different type of visitor, and you probably get more tourists as well in St Ives.
Than in London?
No, but you get, in terms of the amount of visitors, you probably get more visitors who are there for tourism.
Look, Simon, if we sided with you, our lives would be so much easier. So it's so ironic that we are up here defending what essentially makes our jobs 24/7. So I think we would love that moment where if none of you judged us, and if the whole country celebrated the fact that we would charge entry, that we would still be in these seats. I think the fragility of the museum system, I think the tenacity of museum directors, I think the endless cycle of fundraising and idea generation is really just a public service and an ideology that there's a responsibility we have. If we can keep it for free, I think it makes our jobs harder, but it makes us happy to go to sleep.
Okay, at the back.
Hi. So hi Simon, I'm speaking as a sort of former chair of the V&A and as a current BM trustee. So I just want to correct you on one thing. Many museums are not legally allowed to de-accession. The V&A and the British Museum would legally, except in very rare occasions, not allowed to. Having said which, I think there is a fair debate. I mean, fashion changes. A lot of curators would have de-accessioned Caravaggio and Vermeer going back 80 years. The BM did get rid of some Benin bronzes in the 1960s, so there is the danger that if you allow outright de-accessioning, that things that are out of fashion get sold. At the same time, probably there is a case for some prudent culling where we have excesses of what might be considered second, third tier objects, but that does need a change in statute. The second thing I'd say is to do with the regionalism. I completely concur. When we were at the V&A, we were building a museum up in Dundee, but we were very lucky to get huge funding from the Scottish Parliament. Funding is a huge issue, as Hannah said. The National Museums have seen a 30% reduction in funding over the last 7 years, at the same time as which attendance has gone up dramatically, creating its own pressures. I won't get into the issues of charging or not charging, but I think the issue on regionalism is that there is almost no fundraising ability outside of London. I speak from somebody who's from Birmingham, where the museums are in a total mess. So I think there needs to be either some real incentives to encourage regional fundraising, or allocation of money, which, as we know, is very tight, and we're getting squeezed in London, so I'm not sure where it comes from. Scotland was different. Scotland made a big financial commitment to Dundee, which is a very logical place, given two great museums, a history of design, and I think when it opens next year, it'll be a huge success, but it's not straightforward at all. And for the national museums in London, who are already very strapped for cash, and who are already lending, I mean, the British Museum, we have several hundred objects out on loan. It's not through lack of desire, it's really through lack of resource.
Well, you can't argue lack of resource when you give away £20 for everyone who walks out of the door without paying. I mean, there's stacks of money sitting there, but you've decided not to collect from the public who are enjoying it. Well, that's your problem. You go and lobby for it, they'll give you permission. I know what happened with the Tories. But I mean, going back to the main point about the thing, I'm just fascinated. If you treated the national collection as being a national collection, which in a sense it is, these are pictures, this is art that belongs to all of us, and you simply said, what is the best way of allocating this national collection? You'd shift 3/4 of it out of London. You'd put into these great galleries in the provinces with vast numbers of old masters, works of art, whatever it might be, and you'd genuinely be sharing it with the rest of the country. As it is, you keep it all in London, and you find wonderful arguments for defending it in London, but actually it's wrong. And I cannot see why trustees of the BM and the Tate and everything, they always think why we might be missing out on some new fashion. I mean, forget it, just shift the stuff. What's the problem?
Okay, but exactly what Paul said, you can shift the stuff if you then endow the museums and the organisations outside London to look after it. Fine.
Charge for them to see it.
But they're not going to pay for it. I mean, the truth is we've actually looked at charging models, and it doesn't actually work. It doesn't stack up.
Why does every other gallery in Europe charge and you don't?
Because they also have subsidies.
Different models?
You know what it does. If you think, I mean, literally, it's different funding models. If you look at the national, if you say it costs roughly 40 million a year, and we get 6 million visitors, if you charge immediately, that will drop by half to maybe a third. You'd have to charge a hell of a lot to get up to your 40. Because you would lose things. I mean, I can take you through it chapter and verse in a boring way.
We've all done that.
Yeah, we've all done it, and we all continue to, and we will continue to do it.
Yeah, of course.
And to be very boring, and really we shouldn't spend the next 14 minutes on this, but there are hundreds of pages of NPO applications that I learned about in my first month on the job in terms of getting £1.2 million from the Arts Council. And part of that cycle of funding, which for us means we have the lowest proportion of government funding of any public arts institution in the UK, means there's the deepest responsibility to the regions, of which chapters go in and tens of people work on, to ensure that if you are getting £1 per 1.2 million visitors in central London, that you are giving back multiples and sharing of that knowledge. So I would hardly say that it happens in a silo. It's not either or. In the same way that we are giving to the regions, V&A has also created alliances in Sheka with China. One is always thinking about how you're using our assets. So rather than thinking that we're depositories for handouts or sitting on these collections, I think there's a constant engine of entrepreneurship that essentially goes into the survival of these spaces.
Nick?
And in terms of sharing the national collection, I completely agree with you, but and I've already touched upon this, one of our frustrations, I'll just speak from my own gallery, is that we want to do more nationwide, and often the people that we want to work with, the other institutions, don't have the resources, which is wrong. I mean, I wouldn't disagree with that. One of the reasons that we have such a good partnership with the National Trust is that it's a very well-resourced institution, so it's viable. And we want to work with other galleries, and often we and they are stymied by resources. So we're always trying to overcome that. We're not blind to that. We want to do much more. I would love to get more of the collection out of you. I would love to do more national programs, and we already do a lot. But often we hit a buffer because there's issues to do with resources.
Right, someone else?
There's been a lot of talk about the regions, but I want to speak up a little bit for the regions because I'm on the board of National Museums in Liverpool, which you may remember came into being because Margaret Thatcher nationalised these museums when Derek Hatton took control of Liverpool Council and threatened to sell off of the entire collection. So she stepped in, the government nationalised it. It's now, I think it's the only museum group outside London that's funded directly by DCMS. Ironically, the government, in common with its policy, across the arts generally, has been cutting its grant to NML. So we're kind of getting back to where we might have been in 1980, whenever it was. And now, and to pick up the point that the gentleman behind me made, he's absolutely right. The London museums totally rely on the support of very rich benefactors and philanthropists. Whereas in the regions and places like Liverpool, there's absolutely no culture of that. There's no, these museums, certainly ours, have never really had an effective development function. Nobody knows how to raise money. Nobody knows. I had a recent discussion about, when they're throwing a cocktail party, is there even a bucket in the room where people can put a tenner in? Because they just don't think that way. This is not a criticism of my own organisation. It is just the way it is. I just wanted to make that point, and the other point is that blockbusters don't just happen in London. We have the Terracotta Army coming to Liverpool. We are doing that despite the cuts, with no philanthropic or very limited philanthropic support, trying to get airlines to give us a break on the cost of bringing the stuff over. Trying to get people who write, advertising hoardings to do it for free. But fundamentally, the entire budget is coming out of the NML's central funds, which I think is a remarkable achievement. Obviously, we're going to charge for it. If we get the same numbers of people that went to the British Museum exhibition, then we'll cover the cost of it kind of just about. But then you get into the way, museums do their own creative accounting, which we don't need to go into now. But I just wanted to make some just general observations, because there's been a lot of talk about the regions. We get 3 million people a year coming to Liverpool.
Great.
I think Liverpool's a great example, because it's an example that you don't necessarily need to take masterpieces. You can have someone like Sally Talent bringing the Liverpool Biennale. You can have the Manchester Festival. And so you can have these incredible live events which catalyze communities that mean that, of course, you can have the Terracotta Warriors as a physical manifestation and magnet for communities, but you can have these incredible moments of live performance where very dedicated people do go out and fundraise despite the odds, as you're saying.
And just one thing, I was in Liverpool 2 weeks ago, and so went to the Walker, went to Tate Liverpool, saw many great exhibitions and the wonderful collections there, and I completely agree with you. But one point is, of course, Liverpool did have a wonderful history of philanthropy. If you go to Port Sunlight and Lord Leverhulme, that was it. So one thing that we've lost in this country actually is philanthropy across the country. That's one thing we need to get back and develop.
Yes?
I'd like to make a point. I'm struck that, and this is more relevant to the National Gallery and National Portrait Gallery, that there's talk of pictures, whereas, and I work in the contemporary art world, if you think about a lot of contemporary art, it's very large, heavy, therefore to send a representative portion from, say, the Tate collection would be quite difficult to the regions, in terms of transport, installation costs, and so on. So it's not just a question of sending paintings or works of art which are framed. So the costs are much larger, and the intricacies of installations on site in the regions are much more complex. Therefore, I don't think, and that brings me also to the point of complexities of storage in national museums.
One thing you can do is the great sculpture exhibition of the North. Really spectacular and very popular. You can put it outside, provided it's robust, and it'll put on a great show. It's an extraordinary exhibition. But anyway, your point, yes.
With my former Tate hat on, that's actually a really good point, and that's key, because, as you said, many more contemporary works are much more difficult to transport, much more expensive, much more costly, and so at the MPG we have the great gift that we can lend one picture, as you said, and it's affordable, it's achievable, and it has an impact. Whereas for other institutions like the Tate, to lend a very complicated installation is a much trickier proposition for them and, again, the other institutions. That's a very good point.
Yes, lady here. Is there one at the back there too? Yeah, okay. There's one at the back as well.
I'd like to take the conversation for a minute away from funding and the focus on stuff on walls, which is what I think Simon's been pushing. And to pick up Hannah's point at the beginning about the place as a place of solace. and wondered if the panel could just talk for a moment about the experience of being in a different kind of institution, which you go to because the stuff's there, but which you experience as a place, rather than as a book.
Hold on, I can take one or two more questions, then we'll finish with the answer to that very good question. Yes, at the back? Yes?
You've talked exclusively about your adult audience. I wondered if you could say something about your children's education program.
Okay, one more question somewhere? Yes, there, lady there.
I think you need to share skills as well as sharing stuff. I mean, clearly, I come from the regions. I'm now a primary school teacher. I've got lots of interest in museums from many aspects. But yeah, if they're having trouble to know how to curate, to know how to fundraise, I mean, it's clearly there are opportunities in the north. There's Opera North, there's the museums in Liverpool, there's the Bowes Collection, the Yorkshire Sculpture Park. You can fundraise, you clearly can get philanthropy in the north, but you need the skills up there.
Can we go back to that question about the sense of space and the significance of the space of the gallery rather than just the objects in it?
It's interesting, as you mentioned, when I started, my passion had been starting a digital board at Tate, focusing on art and technology, thinking about how to use these spaces. And my partner is an artistic director who's incredibly fabulous and frenetic, Hans Ulrich Obrist. He's written 327 books. He has 48 hours in his day. And so when I came in, I just thought, okay, what we need to do is speed everything up and automate everything. And for the past 20 years, man has been becoming like machine, and now machine is becoming like man. I came in, and the first Silicon Valley hero that showed up, I started sharing my great ideas of expertise, and he said, I just want a place of sanctuary. And as you say, I think that is, in terms of the moment we live in with everything happening so quickly, a place for us to continue to think about how do we create that place of sanctuary, of solitude, of education. I think that education is really key. Does that education just apply to children? Is that a case of lifelong learning? If society is going a certain way and we will all have much more time on our hands eventually, I think it's also, like the great libraries, like the great churches, our responsibility to think of our museums as, yes, these places of sanctuary, to appreciate pictures, to activate whatever is within oneself from photography, but also to think about how we continue reinventing, serving the public, but also, as you say, driving forward the relevance of our institutions so that we're not just talking about pictures or objects, we're talking about ideas and ambitions in these very exciting ways.
Nick.
Well, the point about a place of solace or reflection is completely what motivates me. And I'm very lucky that I had an epiphany when I was still a teenager in a gallery with a group of paintings, and I thought, this is what I want to do. And that's still what motivates me. Every morning when I wake up, I think, even if I have a very difficult day ahead, I know the reason why I do what I do and what I want to achieve. And that's to pass on that experience to other people and to make it as widely available as possible. So that's completely my focus in everything I do, and I think that's a very good point. And of course that applies also to younger people, as I was then, and so that really motivates everything that I do, and really what my colleagues do too at the gallery. I completely agree.
I mean, I'll give you I love the space question. Obviously I like all the questions, but the space one, I stepped out of my room. I'm lucky enough to be staying here. I came out this morning. There's a print after a Van Dyck of two brothers, which the original hangs in the National Gallery, and they're the Stewart brothers, and it's incredible swagger portrait done in about 1647, I think. And they're dressed in silk and finery, and they were painted, there was the young heirs to the Duke of Lennox, I think it was. And before the paint was dry, those two young men were dead in the Civil War. And it's that kind of thing for me when I walk around the National Gallery that I think, I'm so pleased that I can come here. I'm so pleased I can be reminded of the fragility of life, of how transient beauty and youth is, of how we have to make the most of every minute. Every single picture for me in that gallery I can interpret in that way, and I think that's the thing. If you go there and you really learn about it and you really think what the artist was trying to capture, that's why they're there, and that's why these places are so incredibly important.
Well, how nice to end on three answers I totally agree with.
Finally!
All I can say is the first time I encountered this issue, I interviewed Lord Eccles when he was chairman of the British Museum, I think, when the Tory government was introducing charges back in the 1970s. And I remember Eccles saying to me he couldn't justify these charges except for one reason: it kept out the public. And he said, my museum is for scholars, and I don't want this public is just in the way. So it's a great idea to charge. That was not the best of the arguments. But coming back to the question about solace, I've just done a book on cathedrals and now on stations, both of which are places of solace sometimes. But it was very significant. The reason why cathedrals now are very popular, church attendances are fallen by a third since 2000. Cathedral attendances have risen by a third since 2000. Why? It's fairly clear it's not to do with religious worship. It's to do with people wanting to go to a large and beautiful place, to listen to music, to look at beautiful objects, to be on their own, to contemplate and meditate in an environment where they feel they can. It's enhanced by the surroundings. And that seems to me a very good definition of a modern cathedral, modern museum and cathedral. Thank you very much indeed. That's it.
Thank you.